I've recorded about 500 videos on Jewish history now, and one of the things that used to surprise me, unfortunately doesn't surprise me anymore, is that in the top 10 of popularity, my handful of videos on the Khazar conversion remain very popular. And at first I thought, that's a really cool thing, but now I begin to think it says something unfortunate about humanity. So for this video and the next, which are going to focus on the unusual chapter of Khazar Jewry in our larger project, I'm going to first speak about something that is frequently posed as a question, and I'll answer definitively. The answer is no. Ashkenazi Jews are not Khazars. They are not descended from the Khazar people. If they have any connection with the Khazar, it is very, very tiny in proportion to the overwhelming whole, which is largely European and Middle Eastern in background. So let's take some time to understand what the big controversy is about and what is the resolution to something which is a burning question for many people. First of all, what is the Khazar hypothesis? Although it is shrouded in mystery, most historians coalesce around the idea that a population in the region of the Caspian Sea, not too far from the northern Black Sea, encompassing part of southeastern Europe, converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th century. They had come into existence in the 6th century as a proto-empire and then began expanding until they were finally defeated by the people of Kiev and Rus. That would be based in today's Kyiv, Ukraine, in the 10th century, and then they basically disappeared. So here's a map that shows you roughly where the Khazar Empire would have stretched. Again, we can't use like really firm boundaries, but this is the general area. Now, at the same time, more or less, you have the establishment of Jewish Ashkenaz, which is associated primarily with Germany, with the Rhineland, and we begin to see Jewish settlement there from somewhere around the 10th century onward. The name Ashkenaz is of biblical origin, but it is applied in the medieval period to this region of Germany. Now, from what we know from lots of other sources, there's a pretty significant eastward expansion or migration of the Jews of Ashkenaz to Eastern Europe for reasons that I'm looking forward to discussing with you in later videos. But there's a lot of spread of Ashkenazi Jews to the east, and from there they constitute the largest single demographic chunk of European Ashkenazi Jews as a whole. Looking at this outline here in yellow is basically where most Ashkenazi Jews trace their origins to. Of course, there's a big migration to the Americas, particularly from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that's basically the migration that my own ancestors came from, and that's basically the story. The term Ashkenazi, again, derives from medieval Germany, although most of those Jews who used that term later migrated to Eastern Europe, and then from there, many of them to America, Israel, and so on. That's to distinguish them from other ethnic groups within the Jewish people, such as the Sephardim, who trace their origins primarily to the Iberian Peninsula. God willing, we'll talk a lot more about them shortly. Now, here's the Khazarian hypothesis. Since there is something of an overlap between the limits of the Khazar Empire, which had some kind of connection, possibly a conversion to Judaism, perhaps in the 8th century, and the population of Jews that by the time you get to the 20th century, the vast bulk of Ashkenazi Jews are living in Eastern Europe, the Khazar hypothesis says that the Jews that call themselves Ashkenazim coming from Eastern Europe are not descendants of the German Ashkenazim. They are actually descendants from the Khazars, and that's it in a nutshell. Now, why should we care about this is something that we'll talk about in the next video, but that's the essence of the Khazar hypothesis, that the Jews who originate from Eastern Europe are primarily descended from this Turkic tribe living in Central Asia. Perhaps one of the most significant thinkers and writers on this period is Professor Shaul Stamfer of Hebrew University. Great scholar, has written quite a bit on Eastern European Jewish history, and he's published quite a bit on Khazaria in particular. He has a very jaundiced view of the entire conversion process as a whole, the entire conversion story, which I'll speak about in the next video. But he says there are a few really clear reasons why we can say that Ashkenazi Jews are not descended from the Khazars. First of all, there is no DNA evidence to support this. Now, if you go back in my earlier videos, as I've been doing these over the last 10 years, there's been growing amounts of data, and you'll see slight changes even in my own presentation because of the appearance of new data. DNA evidence is one of the most exciting tools that historians have in their, toolbox. And when it comes to the question of biological descent as opposed to halachic identity, Jewish identity by Jewish law, which is a different thing, although they tend to overlap like a Venn diagram, it's really clear that there's no DNA evidence or a very tiny element of DNA evidence to support the idea of a Khazar origin to Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewry. Now, one exception to that rule is the Professor Eran El-Haik, who's written some interesting things on this, but he remains controversial, and most scholars are not accepting the research that he's presented specifically on Khazaria. Now, without being a scientist and be able to get into the real nuts and bolts of this, what I've read about this is that he prepared in 2013, I think it was first published, an analysis of about 1,300 Y chromosomes, 1,300 people looking at their Y chromosomes to try to see what the similarities were between Jews and about 75 odd other nationalities. Unfortunately, the sample was really, really small. Of the Jews, only 8 fit the specific parameters that we're looking at right now. That's a tiny number to really make huge statements about the vast majority of Ashkenazi Jews. Secondly, more significantly, the number of Khazar individuals studied were precisely 0, because there are no Khazars today, and in fact, we haven't had any Khazars for about 1,000 years. There has been no one walking around who claims Khazar descent to whom we can go to for genetic data. In other words, you can't compare Jews to Khazars if you don't have any Khazars to actually say, oh, you're a Khazar. Great, let's take your DNA. So what he did was he essentially guessed, an educated guess, using Georgians and Armenians, which live roughly in the same area, but with 1,000 years of population movement, it's really hard to say that that's reasonable at all. So it's considered widely to be a very unreliable estimate, and most scholars, particularly most historians, are not accepting this limited data evidence to suggest that Jews come from Khazaria. Secondly, we can pile on the burden of proof here. The second thing is there's absolutely no linguistic evidence of Khazar influence on Jews. I mean, one of the things that we would certainly expect to see is that Jews would pick up Khazar terminology in their Yiddish. Yiddish, by the way, is the overwhelmingly dominant native language of the Jews who call themselves Ashkenazi, originating from Eastern Europe. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a census in the Russian Empire, and I think it was 98% of Ukrainian Jews, 97% of Jews throughout the empire, if I remember correctly, claimed Yiddish as their mother tongue. And there is no discernible evidence of Turkic in Yiddish. There are some interesting words here and there that are a kind of uncertain derivation. There's a professor named Weinreich, who is one of the most important theorists of early Yiddish, who argues that the word daven, which means to pray, might come from a Turkic origin, but it's kind of up in the air. Absolutely, Yiddish is basically German. It's overwhelmingly German. Arguments to the contrary, that its grammar is essentially Slavic, is nonsensical to anyone who has studied all 3 language groups. If you've studied German, if you've studied some Slavic languages, and you've studied Yiddish, you know that Yiddish is overwhelmingly German, written with Hebrew characters with a significant borrowing of Hebrew, Aramaic, both Jewish languages, and a certain amount of French, and all the various words that come along as the Jews are traveling through their migrations. The small elements of Slavic grammar that are visible, particularly in the Eastern dialects of Yiddish, which is not at all surprising given that we're talking about living in a Slavic area. They're not Turkic, they're Slavic, very different languages, and they're basically like uses of aspect and other finer grammatical forms. So bottom line is, Yiddish is way, way more German than it is Turkic. The Turkic elements, the Khazar elements, are vanishingly small if they exist at all. Third, there's no cultural evidence. I mean, where are the recipes? Where are the folk customs? Where are the superstitions, the stories, the legends, the songs that one would expect to come from Turkic origins? We simply don't have them in Ashkenazi culture. We have lots of Russian things, lots of Ukrainian, especially lots of Ukrainian, Polish, and so on, after 1,000 years of living in the region. We have evidence of German, of Latin, of French types of cultural accretions that follow the Jews as they travel, but we don't have any Khazarian things. So the burden of proof is clearly on those who want to push this theory. The overwhelming amount of evidence suggests that the model of Jewish migration from Ashkenaz is exactly what happened historically. So then that brings us to the next question: where did Ashkenazi Jews come from? And I get this question a lot, actually. So this is Doron Behar, who is a remarkable geneticist who's really advanced the field quite a bit, and he's done some great studies of DNA, and most of them just appeared in the last few years. One of the most fascinating things that he discovered is that 40% of all Ashkenazi Jews are descended from precisely 4 women, apparently of European origin, and there's some indication that they lived about 1,000 years ago, or perhaps a little bit earlier. No indication they lived like they knew each other, but there are 4 specific women that seems to have had a tremendous impact on Ashkenazi Jews. Furthermore, statistically speaking, there are significant similarities between non-Ashkenazi Jews, like Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews and so on, with Ashkenazi Jews. So in other words, it still seems to be one big family, despite the superficial differences in skin tone and hair texture and so on. But Jews seem to be more or less one family. And there are significant distinctions between, especially in Eastern Europe, between Jews and the peoples among whom they live. So in other words, this all basically fits with the common sense idea of the Jews moving from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. The kind of elements that Dr. Bihar was able to map out include something called genetic drift, which helps to account for some of the superficial presentation of Ashkenazi people. As a layperson, my understanding of genetic drift is basically when you have, and by the way, I'll show you a Y chromosome study in a second that shows a lot more about Jewish males than Jewish females. This happens when, as is very common and well documented, non-Jewish women adopt Judaism and marry into the Jewish people. This may be a much more pronounced conversion, women converting to Judaism, than men converting to Judaism. This helps account for the physical distinctions between, let's say, Mediterranean Jewry and Eastern European Jewry. You also have a phenomenon which is consistent with the historical record of a genetic bottleneck, where you have a population of people that, for a variety of reasons, which could be social, economic, political, it could have to do with persecution, massacres, wars, things like that, but a larger group of people are suddenly shrunk over a period of time to be a much smaller population, like a bottleneck forms, and that means that there are much fewer people from whom the later ancestors derived their origins. This helps explain the fairly large number of genetic disorders that unfortunately afflict Ashkenazi Jews, like breast cancer and Tay-Sachs, which may owe a lot to the fact that there was this bottleneck, perhaps around the turn of the millennium, that meant that the population of Jews living in Northern Europe that would later move to the east represent the basis of a much larger population. So the bottom line of all of this is that it's pretty much what we always were thinking, although Italy may be more important than most historians have thought. Have a look at this map here, which is also part of Dr. Bihar's research, and this is looking specifically at Levites on the Y chromosome. Now, Levites, like Kohanim, are members of the priestly family, and they are, and it's only the males. It's passed down father to son. Mothers do not pass down the Levite connection. So looking at the Y chromosomes of Ashkenazi Jews, he was able to determine that it appears that they do have origins consistent with Middle Eastern distant origin, and then a strong migration through the Italian peninsula to the Ashkenazic heartland in Germany. That would be numbers 1 through 2 in this particular map. And then number 3 is, as we expected, a large migration towards the east, where most Ashkenazi Levites find their origins going back through that original vector. And then, as you can see, the kind of the faded line there of the extension towards the west, along with the arrow labeled number 4, there is a reference back as those Ashkenazi Levites begin to move to the west and, in fact, begin to form families with Sephardic women and non-Ashkenazi Jews generally in the Iberian Peninsula. It is probably at the point number 2 on this map when those 4 mothers appeared, probably somewhere around the year 1000, and then are responsible for this huge expansion of Ashkenazi Jewry, and as a result, a tremendous popularity of Asian food now in America, and so on. Now, if you look at these the green lines here, this is the traditional view of the migration of Jews historically, which there's a lot to say for this, and this does not contradict the historical model that we have well documented of Jews moving their way across the coast of North Africa, but that particular route would not necessarily explain the origins of most Ashkenazi Levites. In other words, while Jews may have been moving along that route number 5, they do not account for the large number of Levites in the Ashkenazi community, and so it's not demonstrated by the research that he has worked on. Nevertheless, we do have Jews moving along the course of North Africa, just not necessarily Levites that would end up producing lines among the Ashkenazim. It's so complicated to see this in so many ways, but you get the basic idea, right? Okay, so that's our short answer. Ashkenazi Jews are not descended from the Khazars. They are descended from the Middle East and possibly through an Italian vector. And there are 4 women, ironically, you know, the Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah of Ashkenazi Jews account for almost half of all Ashkenazi Jews today. In the next video, let us actually go to Khazaria and try to figure out what did happen in the 8th century. What can we say about it intelligently? Okay, thank you very much for watching.